Imagine lying unarmed behind a wrecked tank as a legendary warrior aims an energy blade at your throat. Your heart pounds, every instinct screams to fight or flee. But instead, what comes out of your mouth is a single absurd compliment that freezes the entire battlefield. This is how a supply clerk named Jax stopped a war not with weapons, but with 3 unexpected words. The armored wreckage offered Jax a thin comfort, a fragile barrier between his trembling form and certain destruction. Jagged metal edges tore at his uniform as he pressed closer, each breath catching in his throat like broken glass. This twisted sculpture of war provided no real protection, just the fleeting illusion that maybe, for one more second, he might survive. He could feel the ground vibrating through the cold steel, a constant reminder of the conflict raging around this temporary hiding place. Jax never belonged on this field. His world consisted of supply manifests and inventory logs, not blood-soaked battlefields. As a logistics clerk, his war was fought with data pads and distribution schedules, ensuring ammunition crates and ration packs reached the front lines. He knew the precise weight of a plasma cartridge but had never fired one. He could calculate optimal supply routes through hostile territory, but had never walked them. Now he crouched in the mud where his carefully organized shipments ended their journey, surrounded by the chaotic reality he'd only ever documented from a safe distance. Across the scarred earth, Zyra advanced with the fluid motion of a predator. Her HFY combat armor caught the dull light of this alien world, polished plates shifting with each deliberate step. The energy blade in her hand hummed with a low, hungry frequency that seemed to swallow the battlefield noise around it. She moved without hesitation, her path direct and unquestionable, a study in lethal efficiency that had broken entire human battalions. Her helmet's visor reflected the smoke and ruin, giving nothing back but the image of a world she meant to conquer. Every survival instinct screamed at Jax to run or fight, but both options had vanished. His hands gripped empty air where a weapon should have been. The evacuation route he'd memorized lay buried beneath collapsed fortifications. He was trapped in this pocket of the battlefield, completely exposed as the HFY warrior closed the final meters between them. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with the energy of her blade and the certainty of what came next. Time stretched into something liquid and unnatural. The distant explosions became muted thumps. The shouted commands from fellow soldiers faded to whispers. In this bubble of impending death, everything narrowed to the space between them. The measured pace of her approach, the way her armored boots crushed the scorched earth, the subtle adjustment of her grip on the weapon. This wasn't the grand clash of armies he'd seen in training simulations. This was intimate, personal, and utterly final. His military training offered no answers for this scenario. The manuals covered tactical retreats, defensive maneuvers, even last-stand protocols. Nothing addressed being completely unarmed before a HFY elite warrior. The certainty of his defeat settled in his bones, cold and absolute. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic rhythm counting down his final moments. Then something shifted deep within him. Not courage, not strategy, something more fundamental. The fear didn't vanish, but it made space for something else. The words formed without conscious thought, rising from some untouched place beneath the terror and training. They carried no calculation, no hidden tactic. Just pure, unfiltered human reaction to the impossible beauty of the deadly figure before him. 3 syllables escaped his lips, soft but clear in the unnatural quiet. They hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible, and utterly changing everything. The 3 words hung between them, absurd and impossible. You're gorgeous. They didn't echo across the battlefield but seemed to absorb sound instead, creating a pocket of unnatural silence around the 2 figures. This wasn't flattery or manipulation. It carried no strategic value, no hidden meaning. The words were simply raw human reaction, torn from some deep place untouched by military training or survival instinct. They existed outside the context of war, of enemy and ally, of killer and victim. Zyra's forward motion ceased. Her armored boots settled firmly into the churned earth, the subtle shift in weight sending tiny particles of soil scattering. The hum of her energy blade seemed to diminish, its harsh frequency softening as if the weapon itself hesitated. Her helmet remained fixed on Jax, the dark visor giving no indication of what might be happening behind it. The perfect killing machine had encountered something incomprehensible. Across the blasted landscape, soldiers on both sides noticed the change. Human troops paused in reloading their weapons, their hands frozen halfway through motions practiced 1,000 times. VA warriors lowered their rifles incrementally, their disciplined formations showing the first cracks of uncertainty. Officers on both sides frowned at their tactical displays, searching for some explanation in the data. The rhythm of combat stuttered, then stopped completely. Centuries of military doctrine offered no guidance for this moment. Training simulations covered ambushes, artillery barrages, chemical attacks, every conceivable violence. But no protocol existed for a compliment delivered to an advancing conqueror. Field manuals contained nothing about what to do when the enemy stops killing, to tell you something beautiful. The entire framework of conflict, built on clear roles and expected actions, suddenly had no relevant instructions. The compliment itself became a kind of insult to the natural order of battle. It disregarded the established dynamic between conqueror and conquered. It treated the VA warrior not as a terrifying instrument of war, but as a person capable of receiving admiration. This broke the fundamental logic that had governed their interactions since first contact. The simple, brutal equation of kill or be killed, for 3 heartbeats. The only sound came from the wind moving across torn metal. It whistled through the tank's broken hull, whispered over discarded weapons, carried the scent of ozone and burnt earth. The battlefield held its breath, waiting for the inevitable resumption of violence. Every soldier, human and VA alike, expected the energy blade to complete its arc, to cut through the unnatural pause and restore the familiar reality of combat. The death blow did not come. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain. Sierra remained perfectly still, her weapon poised but unmoving. The hum of her blade continued its quieter frequency, almost thoughtful now. Jax could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each thump measuring the seconds of this impossible reprieve. The air between them seemed charged with something new, something beyond the energy weapon's discharge. This was no calculated ceasefire or tactical withdrawal. It was a rupture in the expected narrative of their encounter, created by 3 simple words that should have been meaningless in this context. The silence grew heavier, filled with unasked questions and shifting possibilities. On the edges of the battlefield, soldiers began to exchange puzzled glances, their weapons gradually lowering further as the expected violence failed to materialize. Zyra's focus narrowed to the human before her, another target in a long sequence of victories. This moment should have been clean, efficient, a single motion to remove an obstacle. Her entire existence had been shaped for this purpose, every instinct honed toward conquest. She was Va, an instrument of absolute force, her identity forged in the cold certainty of overwhelming strength. Fear was what she inspired in others, not something she experienced herself. The words that hung in the air did not register as sound so much as a disturbance, a ripple in the perfectly ordered reality she understood. For her entire military career, she had been perceived as a symbol, an unstoppable force, a legend made real. Soldiers saw the polished armor, the lethal precision, the reputation that preceded her. Civilians saw only the coming subjugation. No one had ever looked past the warrior to the individual beneath. This human's words suggested something else entirely, something that bypassed the armor and the legend to touch upon a part of herself she had long since buried. There was no tactical advantage to his statement, no discernible reason behind it. It simply was, and that sincerity unsettled her more than any weapon. Her training screamed at her to complete the motion, to eliminate the anomaly and restore order. The blade in her hand felt like an extension of her will, eager to fulfill its purpose. Every drill, every battle, every lesson reinforced the same truth. Hesitation meant vulnerability. Yet something held her arm in place, a curiosity deeper than doctrine. She found herself studying the clerk's face, searching for any hint of deception, any sign this was some crude human tactic. Her enhanced vision picked up the fine tremors in his hands, the rapid pulse visible at his throat, the sweat beading on his forehead. There was terror there, unmistakable and raw, but beneath it something else lingered, a startling honesty. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He wasn't bargaining for his life. He had spoken without thinking, and the truth of it lingered between them, fragile and disarming. The energy blade felt heavier in her grip, its hum softer, as if the weapon itself was reconsidering its purpose. She became aware of the weight of her armor, the constriction of her helmet, the way her own breathing sounded too loud in the sudden quiet. For the first time, she questioned the simplicity of her role. She had been taught to see enemies as obstacles, their elimination a necessary step toward victory. This human refused to fit that category. His fear was genuine, his words were plain, and his gaze held no hatred, only a bewildering mix of terror and awe. The clarity of her mission blurred at the edges, replaced by a dawning uncertainty. Her fingers tightened slightly around the hilt of her blade, not in preparation to strike, but as if seeking reassurance in its familiar shape. The battlefield around them seemed to fade into insignificance. The shouts of soldiers, the distant thrum of engines, the crackle of fires, all receded into background noise. In this suspended moment, there were only two people standing on scarred earth, separated by inches and immeasurable distance. She could see the dust settling on his sleeves, the way his eyes refused to look away even as they widened with fear. There was a humanity here that her training had never accounted for, a vulnerability that felt both frightening and compelling. Her own rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly, the tension in her shoulders easing by a fraction. The weapon remained raised, but its angle shifted from lethal to questioning. She found herself wondering not how to eliminate him, but why he had spoken. What had he seen that made him say such a thing at such a moment? The simplicity of his observation challenged the complexity of her purpose, and for the first time, she hesitated not out of weakness, but from a need to understand. Zira's voice cut through the silence, flat and analytical. "You are not afraid." The words carried a tone of genuine confusion, as if she were observing data that contradicted all previous models. Her head tilted slightly, the movement almost imperceptible through her helmet. She expected denial, perhaps even defiance, the standard responses of soldiers facing execution. Instead, she received something entirely different. Jax's reply came without hesitation, his voice thin but clear. "Oh, I'm terrified." There was no attempt to mask the tremor in his words. He didn't posture or pretend. He simply stated the truth as he felt it, raw and immediate. His hands remained at his sides, palms open, as if offering his fear as the only thing he had left to give. This was not bravery in the conventional sense. It was not a boast or a challenge. It was the purest form of honesty, stripped of all pretense. In that moment, Jax refused to perform the role expected of him. He would not die pretending to be unafraid. He would not grant his execution the satisfaction of a courageous final stand. His vulnerability became his only weapon, and he wielded it without shame. On that battlefield where soldiers measured their worth by their ability to conceal fear, his admission was revolutionary. It broke the unspoken code that demanded stoicism in the face of death. By naming his terror, he rejected the entire performance of warfare. He stood there shaking and exposed, and in doing so demonstrated a different kind of strength, one that required no armor, no weapon, no lie. Zira found herself disarmed not by force, but by truth. Her grip on the energy blade loosened almost imperceptibly. She had faced countless enemies who hid their fear behind aggression or resignation. None had ever offered it to her so openly. This honesty created a strange new connection between them, a bridge built not on strength but on shared fragility. For the first time, she saw not just an enemy, but a person trembling with the same fundamental dread she herself had long suppressed. In his eyes, she recognized something unsettlingly familiar. Behind the fear lay a clarity that mirrored her own hidden doubts. The silent questions about purpose, the weight of endless conflict, the loneliness of being seen only as an instrument of war. His admission echoed in the hollow spaces of her own conditioning, stirring something she had been trained to ignore. The dynamic between them shifted completely. This was no longer an execution. It had become an interrogation of a different kind, not of tactics or positions, but of meaning. Zira's weapon remained active, but its purpose felt increasingly distant. She studied him not as a target, but as a puzzle. Why would someone choose vulnerability when strength was demanded? Why admit fear when courage was expected? The air between them seemed charged with a new tension, one born of curiosity rather than hostility. Jax's breathing remained shallow, his body still braced for impact, but something in his posture had changed. He had surrendered the pretense of control, and in doing so had gained a different kind of power. Zira's head tilted again, this time more noticeably. The hum of her blade softened another degree, as if the weapon itself was recalibrating to this unexpected turn of events. Soldiers on both sides watched, their own fears momentarily forgotten in the face of this strange standoff. The familiar script of battle had been discarded, replaced by a conversation that defied all military logic. In the space between a warrior and a clerk, between a blade and a confession, something new and fragile began to take shape. Zyra's voice emerged again, lower this time, stripped of its earlier certainty. "You see a person." The words hung in the air, neither question nor statement, but something in between, a probe sent into unknown territory. She was testing the boundaries of this new reality. This space where compliments replaced combat and fear was spoken aloud instead of concealed. Her head remained tilted, the helmet's dark visor fixed on Jax as if trying to decipher a code she had never been trained to break. The energy blade in her hand remained active but still, its hum a quiet undercurrent to this strange conversation. Jax did not pause to consider his answer. "Yeah, I do." The response came quickly, soft but clear, carrying a simplicity that felt like a physical force in the charged space between them. There was no elaboration, no attempt to explain or justify. Just 3 syllables that carried the weight of an entire shift in understanding. His eyes remained locked on her, refusing to look away even as his body trembled with residual fear. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable, a raw authenticity that cut through layers of armor and conditioning. He saw the warrior, of course. He saw the polished plates of Va combat armor, the deadly grace of her movements, the reputation that preceded her across battlefields. He saw the enemy who had shattered human defenses with ruthless efficiency. But he also saw something else. The subtle tension in her stance that suggested more than mere aggression, the slight tilt of her head that spoke of curiosity rather than contempt. He saw the woman beneath the legend, the individual behind the conquest. This dual recognition became a weapon she had no defense against, a truth that bypassed all her training. For Zyra, this was entirely unfamiliar territory. Her entire existence had been built on being perceived as a force, a symbol, an instrument of war. Soldiers looked at her and saw only the armor, the blade, the inevitable victory. Civilians saw only their coming subjugation. No one had ever acknowledged the person within, the complex individual shaped by duty, discipline, and the weight of expectations. This simple acknowledgement unsettled her more than any military counterattack could have. It suggested a reality where she was more than her function, where her identity extended beyond conquest. A fragile connection formed in the dust between them, built not on negotiation or strategy, but on this unexpected moment of recognition. It was a thread of understanding spun from honesty and received with cautious curiosity. The energy blade's hum seemed to soften further, as if the weapon itself recognized this shift in purpose. Around them, the battlefield remained frozen, soldiers on both sides watching this exchange that defied all protocols and expectations. Syrah's grip on her weapon adjusted slightly, the motion subtle but significant. The angle of the blade changed from offensive to neutral, its deadly edge no longer directly focused on Jax. She found herself studying him with renewed intensity, not as a target but as a person who had offered her something no enemy ever had, the simple acknowledgement of her humanity. This was not how wars were supposed to unfold. This was not how conquerors and their victims were meant to interact. The trust that began to form was delicate, impossible by any military standard, yet undeniably present. It existed in the space between her lowered weapon and his open hands, in the quiet that had replaced the sounds of battle, in the way they both seemed to breathe in unison, despite standing on opposite sides of a conflict. This was no grand alliance or negotiated peace, just 2 people recognizing each other's humanity in the most unlikely of places. The dust settled around their boots, the distant fires continued to burn, but something fundamental had changed in the heart of the battlefield. The standoff between the 2 figures became a living tableau, a frozen moment that seemed to hold the entire battlefield in suspension. Around them, the wreckage of war lay scattered like broken toys abandoned by giant children. Smoke continued to rise from smoldering vehicles, but the sounds of combat had fallen away, replaced by an unnatural quiet that felt heavier than any bombardment. The scene possessed the strange quality of a paused recording, where every detail stood out with impossible clarity, yet refused to advance to the next frame. Human soldiers watched from their defensive positions, their rifles lowering incrementally as the expected violence failed to materialize. Fingers rested uncertainly against triggers, their pressure lightening as seconds stretched into minutes. Helmets turned toward the strange scene, expressions hidden behind visors but postures speaking of confusion and wonder. These were men and women trained for immediate response, for split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. Now they found themselves immobilized not by enemy fire, but by the complete breakdown of expected outcomes. Across the field, HFY warriors exchanged glances through their identical helmets, the subtle tilts of heads conveying questions none had been trained to answer. Their disciplined formations, usually perfect examples of military precision, showed subtle signs of unraveling. Shoulders relaxed by degrees, weapons dipped toward the ground, stances shifted from aggressive to observant. They looked to their officers for guidance but found only the same uncertainty reflected in the hesitant postures of their leaders. The clear chain of command that usually directed their every move now offered no instruction for this scenario. The established script of warfare lay in tatters around them. Centuries of military doctrine, countless battles fought across star systems, entire training regimens built around predictable enemy behaviors, all became suddenly irrelevant. This was not part of any simulation or strategic planning session. No veteran's memoir contained stories of conversations replacing confrontations. The very nature of conflict between their species had been fundamentally altered by 3 words spoken in terror. Officers on both sides watched through binoculars and scopes, their hands pausing over communication panels. They awaited orders that did not come, protocols that remained unwritten, solutions that their extensive training had never provided. Command centers fell silent as reports stopped flowing and situations stalled. The efficient machinery of war ground to a halt, its gears jammed by this single inexplicable moment between a clerk and a conqueror. This was not a negotiated truce or formal surrender. Those would have followed established patterns, involved clear terms, maintained the framework of conflict even while pausing it. This was something entirely different, an organic cessation born not from strategy but from human connection. The energy that usually drove violence forward dissipated like mist under morning sun, leaving behind only bewildered silence. Soldiers who moments before had been prepared to kill or die now simply watched, their combat instincts overwhelmed by curiosity. A single foolish moment had disrupted generations of animosity. The hatred between their species, cultivated through years of propaganda and reinforced by countless battles, suddenly seemed fragile and artificial. The inevitability of HFY conquest, once taken as absolute truth by both sides, now appeared negotiable. The entire narrative of their conflict, of unstoppable invaders and desperate defenders, had been interrupted by a more fundamental truth about recognition and shared humanity. The battlefield became hostage to a conversation. The thousands of soldiers, the tons of military hardware, the strategic objectives worth entire planets, all waited upon the words exchanged between 2 people standing in the dust. The direction of the war, the fate of worlds, the future of 2 species suddenly hinged on whether a supply clerk and a warrior could find common ground. The massive war machines stood silent, their destructive power rendered irrelevant by the simple power of human connection. Alliances are not supposed to form this way. They emerge from strategy sessions in fortified command centers, through calculated treaties signed by officials in clean rooms far from the fighting. They are built on mutual interests, resource agreements, and carefully negotiated terms that benefit both sides. The process involves diplomats, security analysts, and political advisors weighing every word and every consequence. It is a dance of power and compromise conducted by professionals who understand the rules of engagement between civilizations. What happened on that battlefield followed none of these established patterns. They certainly do not begin with a compliment spoken in pure terror to an enemy warrior. History contains no records of peace accords triggered by accidental admiration. Military academies teach negotiation tactics, not how 3 unexpected words can halt an advancing army. The entire concept defies logical progression from conflict to resolution. Yet there on the scarred earth, surrounded by wreckage and watching soldiers, a new possibility took shape between them. It grew not from any plan or design, but simply because one person saw another person where only an enemy should exist. This fledgling connection formed outside any formal process. There were no negotiations, no terms discussed, no concessions made. The alliance, if it could be called that, sprang from a single moment of unguarded truth. It was built on the shaky foundation of a terrified clerk's honesty and a warrior's surprised hesitation. This was not how interstellar relations were supposed to work. The adults in charge, The officers and commanders on both sides found themselves completely unprepared for this development. Their sophisticated communication systems remained silent, their tactical displays showing a situation that made no strategic sense. Their entire military structure was built on clear hierarchies and unquestioned orders. They understood how to manage fear, how to deploy forces, how to break enemy morale through overwhelming force. They had protocols for surrender, for ceasefires, for prisoner exchanges, but they possessed no manual for what happened when soldiers simply stopped fighting, because two people started seeing each other differently. The control systems that had governed warfare for generations could not process this organic, unpredictable shift in dynamics. This was something that grew from the ground up, not something imposed from command centers. It carried a power that formal agreements often lacked, the raw energy of genuine human connection. The seed of peace planted in that moment was not some carefully cultivated hybrid developed by diplomats. It was a wild, unexpected growth that emerged from the most unlikely soil. A misfired compliment spoken without thought or intention became the catalyst that thousands of hours of negotiation had failed to achieve. The simplicity of it all felt almost ridiculous when measured against the complexity of their conflict. Years of propaganda, generations of hatred, entire cultures built around opposition, all paused because one person admitted fear and another hesitated. The massive war machines stood silent, their destructive potential rendered momentarily irrelevant. The complex web of military strategy and political maneuvering that had brought them to this battlefield seemed suddenly fragile compared to this simple moment of recognition. Soldiers on both sides watched, their training inadequate for this new reality. They knew how to respond to attacks, how to advance under fire, how to hold positions against overwhelming odds. They did not know how to process watching their enemies become something else before their eyes. The familiar categories of us and them, friend and foe, conqueror and conquered, all began to blur in the unsettling quiet. The future of their conflict, once seeming inevitable and fixed, now appeared open to possibilities none had imagined. The fragile quiet shattered not from hesitation or doubt, but from above. A new shadow fell across the battlefield, deeper and colder than any natural darkness. It moved like spilled ink across the sky, swallowing the ambient light from the system's distant star. The temperature dropped several degrees in an instant, the air growing heavy with a static charge that raised the hairs on arms and sent shivers through armor plating. This was no weather phenomenon or tactical maneuver from either side. This was something entirely other. The Overclaw descended without ceremony or warning. Their vessels emerged from the unnatural darkness not through conventional flight, but as if condensing from the shadow itself. They moved with a silent, hungry grace that made the VA war machine seem clumsy by comparison. These were not ships designed for atmospheric entry or combat landing. They were extensions of the darkness, manifestations of intent given form. Their shapes shifted and flowed, refusing to hold a single configuration, as if refusing to be fully perceived by the limited senses of those below. This third faction operated on principles neither human nor VA could comprehend. They sought no territory, demanded no resources, fought for no ideological cause. Their purpose existed outside the familiar patterns of conquest and defense. They moved through battlefields like harvesters through ripe fields, but their crop was nothing either species valued in material terms. They fed on the very energy of conflict itself, drawing sustenance from the chaos and suffering that warfare produced. Zyra's voice cut through the growing dread. Flat with realization, they harvest our misery, our poor fashion choices, our energy. Her helmet turned slightly toward Jax, the movement quick and tense. Our pain, our death. That is what they consume. The words landed with chilling clarity. This explained the persistent rumors across both military networks. Battlefields that went suddenly quiet, entire campaigns that vanished without debris or distress signals. The Overclaw didn't conquer worlds. They devoured conflicts, leaving behind only emptiness where war had once raged. The stalled battle between human and VA forces represented a denied feast. The sudden cessation of violence, the drop in fear and pain and hatred, these were nutrients being withheld from beings that depended on such energies. The personal standoff between a clerk and a warrior had unintentionally starved a predator that fed on their conflict. Now that predator had come to investigate why its meal had been interrupted, and to correct the situation. The interstellar implications became immediately apparent. This was no longer about human resistance or VA expansion. The confrontation shifted from planetary to cosmic scale in the space of a heartbeat. Two species that had been trying to destroy each other moments before now faced a common enemy that threatened something far more fundamental than territory or resources. The Overclaw threatened their very capacity to exist as independent beings, reducing their struggles and sufferings to mere sustenance for forces beyond their understanding. But its turn was no longer a threatening gesture. It lifted, pointing skyward, its humming taking on a new urgency. His trembling hands clenched into fists, not out of aggression but out of sheer shock at the reality that had suddenly descended upon them. Their budding understanding was forged in the fire of need, transforming from philosophical curiosity into survival necessity. Vulnerability became their only remaining currency. Armor, weapons, training, these seemed laughably inadequate against this new threat. All they possessed was the raw, unguarded connection forged seconds before. Acknowledging fear, seeing the other's humanity, finding common ground in impossible situations, these were no longer abstractions. They were tools, perhaps the only tools with which to confront an enemy that neither understood nor cared for such things. The shadows deepened, the chill intensified. The first forms separated from the darkness, not ships or creatures, but coalescing masses of pure intent. They descended upon the quiet battle zone, moving with a terrifying patience like hungry creatures finally approaching a delayed meal. Both human and Wa soldiers looked up, their differences paling before the greater threat. Weapons were reoriented but not against each other. A makeshift, desperate alliance formed out of overwhelming need. Energy surged through the air, not the energy of explosion or propulsion, but something older, hungrier. Silence gave way to a low hum, not of machinery, but of the void itself. The battlefield, a fragile breeding ground of hope and understanding between two species moments before, was now the front line of a completely different battle.